This lecture, we will be discussing skeletal muscle tissue. This lecture will overlap a little bit with some of your other lectures regarding muscle tissues. We will be discussing a little bit with regards to the different types of muscle tissues. But for the most part, we will be just discussing skeletal muscle cells and how those skeletal muscle cells combine to produce skeletal muscle tissue. So once again, there will be a little bit of overlap with some of the other lectures, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing because that just provides a little bit more in the way of review and context for the specific lectures. So just bear with us if there's any overlap, and again, once again, that'll just prove to give you a little bit extra review. So just with regards to some background information on muscle tissue in general, again, muscle tissue, as you learned in your tissue lectures, contains cells that are specialized for contraction. And by contraction, what that means is the cells, by means of contractile proteins within the cells, change shape, and in doing so, they exert force, some sort of force, on other tissues. Normally that's a pulling type of motion, but in some cases it can generate other types of pressure. Once again, as we probably went over in the general tissues lecture, there are three basic types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, sometimes referred to as striated muscle, which we'll be discussing in depth in this lecture, as well as two other types of muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue and cardiac muscle tissue. There are some slight differences in structure between skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle tissue. For the most part, the different types of skeletal muscle cells have a lot of the same intracellular components, a lot of the same protein filaments and things like that. However, they're often arranged differently, and those differences in structure and arrangement give the different types of muscle different properties. For instance, differences in speed of contraction, force of contraction, tendency to fatigue, and things like that. So once again, in the individual lectures that deal with these particular types of muscle cells, you'll go over that, and you'll want to keep that in mind, where the differences in structure are going to generate differences in function and effect. Now, in this particular lecture, once again, we are going to be dealing specifically with once again, in this particular lecture, we will be discussing skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, just like any other muscle tissue, is specialized for contraction, and in so doing produces movement. Before we begin talking about skeletal muscle tissue, however, I want to just take a moment to discuss the differences between muscle tissue and muscles. We often refer to muscle tissue, skeletal muscles. We often use these terms interchangeably. However, it's important to have an understanding of the slight differences in what these terms mean. Muscles are an organ, just like any other organ in your body, like your lungs, like your skin, like your brain, like your spinal cord. And as you learned in one of the other lectures, your organs are structures that are made up of multiple different types of your basic four tissues. So you've got, typically most organs have at least two or more of the different types of tissues: muscle tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and epithelial tissue. Muscles are just like that. Muscles, as the organs of your muscular system, contain all different types of tissue. They contain nervous tissue for stimulation, they contain epithelium for organization and protection, they contain connective tissue also for organization, they contain nervous tissue for stimulation, they contain connective tissue for organization, protection, attachment, things like that. So muscles, as an organ, contain all of the different types of tissues. Of course, that also means they're going to contain muscle tissue, which is a set of cells that are specialized for contraction. So this is just a brief discussion of the differences in these two terms, and you want to make sure that you've got this in sort of forefront in your mind as you're going through, and your instructor says muscle and muscle tissue and things like that. Now, muscles got their name, and you can see my little friends coming into the screen here. Muscles, skeletal muscles, got their name because when some of the first anatomists were looking at them, they looked like little mice. Apparently they reminded him of little mice running underneath the person's skin when they moved. And the prefix mus actually means mouse or little mouse. So they actually looked like little mice scurrying under the skin. Muscles, skeletal muscles, contain skeletal muscles comprise roughly half of your body's mass. So a great deal of your body is contained in the form of these muscles. Muscles are actually, in a sense, types of transducers. Transducers are structures which convert one form of energy into another form of energy. In the case of your muscles, these organs take chemical energy in the form of ATP that is produced by the mitochondria in the body's cells, and they use that energy, chemical energy, and convert it into mechanical energy in the form of motion or movement. And that's what skeletal muscles do. They allow you to, for the most part, interact with your environment. Now, we'll talk about some other functions of skeletal muscles that are not necessarily interaction with your environment as we would often interpret it, but it does sort of fall under this category. So, skeletal muscles, in general, have a number of specific functions. Of course, the one that we are likely most familiar with is production of movement. Those muscles are going to pull on the bones of your skeleton, and in so doing, move your body around. And that's most of how we interact with our environment. So producing movement by pulling on your bones, that's one general function. Another general function is maintenance of posture. This also is a function of your muscles pulling on those bones. There is always a certain amount of muscle tone and partial contraction that is necessary and required for maintaining posture, mostly to combat gravity when you're standing or sitting. So that's another general function of skeletal muscles. Also, stabilization of joints. Skeletal muscles help to strengthen and stabilize joints, keeping them from moving when they're not supposed to move and moving them when you want them to move. So, once again, a function of those muscles pulling on the bones of your skeleton at certain points helps to stabilize and strengthen joints. They will also control the openings and passageways in your body. A lot of this is controlled, especially internally, is controlled by smooth muscle. However, certain sphincters, certain openings, particularly those that are open to the outside of the body, have an additional ring of skeletal muscle in the form of a sphincter that you can, for the most part, voluntarily control, and that also helps to control movement of substances through openings and passageways. And finally, generation of heat. As you no doubt have discovered if you've ever worked out hard aerobically, muscles, when they contract, generate a great deal of heat. So these are the 5 general types of functions that skeletal muscles provide for your body. Skeletal muscle organs as we mentioned earlier, are made up of skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, as you're aware of from your tissue lectures, is made up of skeletal muscle cells. Now, in this particular lecture, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail with regards to the internal structure of skeletal muscle cells. That will be in a different lecture. However, we do need to touch on briefly one aspect of the internal structure of skeletal muscles, because it bears on why they're called skeletal or striated muscles. Skeletal muscle is found in muscles that we control by conscious effort. We can consciously contract and allow these muscles to relax, and as a result they are also called voluntary muscle. Another name for skeletal muscles is striated muscle, and the reason that skeletal muscles are sometimes referred to as striated muscle is because of the appearance of the skeletal muscle cells. If you look at this micrograph showing the skeletal muscle cells, you can see that they are banded in appearance. The term that refers to that is striated. So they have these striations, which are clearly visible by looking at the external cell. The reason for these striations has to do with the structure of the contractile protein filaments inside the muscle cells. And again, we're not going to go into detail with that in this lecture, but suffice to say that the arrangement of those protein filaments is such that they overlap in certain areas, and where they overlap, it creates the darker regions, and where they are not overlapping, that creates the lighter regions. And as a result, you get this alternating light and dark banding pattern because of the arrangement of these filaments. Now, the arrangement of the filaments is also going to have an effect on the contractile properties of the muscle cells and the muscle tissue as a whole. As we mentioned earlier, that can have to do with things like the contractile force and how quickly these muscles contract. Skeletal muscle, because of the arrangement of this muscle tissue, contracts very quickly, but it also fatigues very quickly. As the ATP gets used up, the muscles weaken and they lose their ability to contract rather quickly. So skeletal muscle is a relatively versatile type of muscle. It can result in power contractions, and it can change very quickly between fine motor movements and power motor movements because of its ability to contract, but it can't hold a sustained contraction for very long without fatiguing. A little bit more discussion of terminology. Another thing that you're going to need to be aware of is that with regards to muscle tissue, the terms cell and fiber are often used interchangeably. So if you hear me use the term muscle fiber, and if you hear me use the term muscle cell, those two are basically synonymous for our purposes. So muscle cell and muscle fiber are basically the same thing. So as we mentioned before, skeletal muscles are organs, and as such they contain elements of other types of tissues. In this particular diagram showing you a cross-section of some of the different areas within a muscle, you can see the orange areas showing you the area that are muscle cells themselves, but you can also see other structures within the diagram. There's blood vessels there, which are organs in and of themselves for nourishment and providing oxygen and getting rid of waste products. You can see a lot of the connective tissue wrappings. We'll be discussing these wrappings in particular in a few minutes, but those wrappings are connective tissues. Connective tissues are typically there for organization and attachment. There's nerves and nerve cells that run to and through the muscles. This is for stimulation. Also, they help to facilitate reflexive contractions. So there are a lot of different types of other tissues, and in some cases even other organs, which are contained within the body of the muscle. One particular set of connective tissue elements is important. These are often referred to as series-elastic components. They are found in between muscle fibers and things that they're attached to, such as bone or other connective tissues. They, again, are connective tissues, so they're not excitable nor are they contractile. But in some cases, they do have other component But in some cases, they do have other qualities which contribute to the overall qualities of the muscle. For instance, these are often extensible and sometimes slightly elastic. Now, you don't necessarily want them too elastic because this could contribute negatively to the ability of the muscle to contract, but some of these elastic and extensible qualities do help to facilitate other functions like adding to the power output and efficiency of the muscles, helping them return to their original resting lengths, and of course, being that they're connective tissue, they also allow the muscle cells to be connected to other components, sometimes connected in linear series. So these series elastic elements are important to the overall functioning of the muscle tissue. So now let's look at the connective tissue wrappings that I was talking about earlier. Muscles, skeletal muscles, are very, very highly partitioned and highly organized. If you look at, once again, the same diagram before, I've highlighted three words in particular: endomysium, paramysium, and epimysium. These are the three different types of connective tissue wrappings which are found within the muscle, the body of the muscle. We're going to start our discussion at the smallest level of organization that we're going to be talking about today. That's the level of the muscle cell or the muscle fiber. So we're going to be starting at this level right here. And this little projection that you can see coming out of the muscle, that is an individual muscle cell. And as you can see, the individual muscle cell has a little wrapping that wraps around the outside of it. That wrapping is called the endomysium. Endomysium. Endo, the prefix endo means within. And the portion of the word my, refers to the muscle itself. A myofibril is an example of a muscle tissue protein contained within a muscle cell. So the endomysium is the connective tissue layer that wraps individual muscle cells, and it basically partitions them off from each other. So you have these individual muscle cells wrapped in their individual endomysial wrapping. And the endomysium is made up of a particular type of connective tissue. It's made up of areolar connective tissue, which is a very, very fine type of connective tissue that can stretch and deal with the shape changing that those muscle cells go through on a regular basis. Now, another thing that you might notice is the fact that the muscle cells are bundled together in these little bundles. Those little bundles are called fascicles. And a fascicle, essentially, you can think of as a group of muscle cells. The fascicle itself is also wrapped in another one of these connective tissue wrappings. It is wrapped in the paramysium. So you have the endomysium, which goes around the individual muscle cells, and then those individual muscle cells, or muscle fibers, again, the two words are synonymous, are grouped together in these bundles, and those bundles of individual muscle cells are called fascicles, and those fascicles also have their own wrapping, and that is the paramysium. Peri means around, so these perimysial wrappings wrap around and partition off the fascicles. The perimysium is made up of a more durable, dense, fibrous connective tissue. Finally, the muscle body as a whole, as you can kind of see, is made up of a series of these different fascicles. Here's a fascicle here, here's a fascicle here, here's a fascicle here, and all of these fascicles, wrapped in their individual perimysia, if you look at them all together, form the body or the belly of the muscle. And that overall muscle is also wrapped in its own connective tissue wrapping that is called the epimysium. The epimysium is also a dense connective tissue. In this case, it's dense, irregular connective tissue, and that allows the connective tissue to deal with stresses that come in from all sorts of different directions, which will happen when the muscle changes shape and pulls on different bones. And then around the epimysium is even another connective tissue wrapping, often referred to as the deep fascia, which surrounds the whole thing. Another important aspect with regards to these connective tissue wrappings is they are all continuous with the tendon. So that way, when the muscle cells contract, they'll pull on the tendons, and these connective tissue wrappings will move along with the individual muscle cells. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this particular lecture has to do with the functioning and the attachments of the muscle as a whole. So here we have a diagram showing you a couple of muscles that are associated with the shoulder and the upper arm. In particular, we're going to be looking at the biceps muscle, which is located right here. And in particular, I want to discuss some properties of the different types of muscles, of the different individual muscles. Most people, when you say muscle, you think of the big fleshy part of the muscle, which is what we refer to as the belly. This is the thicker middle region of the muscle. What a lot of people don't realize is that muscle, in order to do its work, when it contracts, has to attach to at least two places. And there's two basic types of attachment points. We talk about the origin of the muscle. The origin is the part of the muscle that is attached to a point that is stationary, or a point that doesn't move when the muscle contracts. In order to produce a movement, a muscle is going to have to brace itself, connect to an immobile point. That way, when it contracts, it will move something by pulling on and bracing on that immobile point. And the origin is the point of attachment when a muscle contracts that doesn't move. Now, depending on the shape of the muscle, not all muscles are going to have a very, very distinct origin and insertion attachment point like the bicep does. If it's a sphincter, it may not have, this quite distinct origin and insertion. But in a linear muscle, like you're seeing here in terms of the bicep or the triceps or a lot of the muscles in most of your appendages, you have a distinct origin, which is a point that doesn't move, and then the other point of attachment is referred to as the insertion. The insertion is the attachment point that does move when the muscle contracts. So once again, the three regions are the belly of the muscle, which is that thicker middle region that's primarily muscle cells, and then you have the two attachment points. The origin, which is the attachment point that typically remains stationary during muscle contraction, and the insertion, which is the attachment point that tends to move, or at least move more so than the origin when the muscle contracts. While we're on the subject of attachments, we need to discuss how muscles attach to bones. Most of the time, muscles have what is referred to as indirect attachments. What that means is the muscle cells themselves are not directly attached to the bones. There's some sort of intermediate tissue, like a tendon, that connects the muscle to a bone. So what happens is the connective tissue parts of the muscle extend out beyond the body of the muscle and attach to the bone. And typically they do this by interweaving their fibers through the external connective tissue, the perichondrium of the bone, or the periosteum of the bone, or in some cases the perichondrium that surrounds cartilage. An indirect attachment is typically more common in the body because it tends to be more durable. The muscle itself isn't dealing with actually attaching to the bone, and there's less wear and tear on the muscles. Another factor associated with this indirect type of attachment is that it tends to make joints and attachments less bulky. You can attach a lot of connective tissue in a small area, whereas if you were to attach the muscle directly to the bone, it would take a much larger area of attachment. So in addition to cutting down on the wear and tear on the muscle cells themselves, the indirect attachment will help to concentrate the pulling force of the muscle by concentrating that force over a smaller area. There are some cases where you have direct attachment of muscles in the body, but they tend to be much more rare than an indirect attachment. In the case of a direct attachment, the epimysium of the muscle is fused directly to the periosteum of the bone without any sort of intermediary connective tissue like a tendon. Button